Critical race theory is now being pushed in nearly every major institution in the United States, from schools to military and from corporate offices to social media platforms. As it spreads, however, questions are growing on its real agenda with Marxist thought. And while it's often criticized as being a Marxist-inspired system, the full connection is rarely explained. So has Marxist thought infiltrated American education, business, and politics? According to James Lindsay, best-selling author and founder of New Discourses, the answer is a resounding yes. And even beyond this, he says that the idea isn't just inspired by Marxism. Instead, it's the new form that Marxism has taken. To learn more about this, we sat down for a discussion. Hey, James, thanks for being on Crossroads.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
You know, so you did a very interesting book that touched on a lot of parts about critical race theory that nobody really talks about normally. And, you know, you hear it all the time that critical race theory is a Marxist type or Marxist influenced or loosely Marxist ideology, but nobody really explains it that well. I think the best description is usually like they kind of replace economy with race. But you come from an interesting point where, you mentioned in the book that you didn't quite believe this at first, but through the process of researching over the years, you've come to understand that not only is it Marxist-inspired, but it is Marxist. Can you explain this to us?
Yeah, it's been a long trajectory. So I did say that in the book, and we've spoken about it in the past. I definitely did not think that critical race theory was Marxist. It wasn't coming from what looked like the traditional track of Marxism. It's coming mostly out of black feminism. It didn't, in law, critical legal studies had some influence of Marxism, but it had other influences as well. So it seemed to have a different take. It's talking about race instead of economics. It's talking about this, kind of cultural, structural view of the world instead of talking about a material, structural view of the world. It's not talking about, focusing on labor. It, in fact, seems like it doesn't care about the working class at all. It's very elitist. It grafts, obviously, onto corporate interests extremely well. So there were a lot of reasons to suspect that this was very different from Marxism. And what's slowly peeling back the onion over the last 3 or 4 years of reading this and reading Marx and reading the neo-Marxists from the middle of the 20th century, started to realize, no, Marxism has just been evolving. It's like a virus that's been picking up, new ways to infiltrate into different potential hosts. And the underlying core is exactly the same. And in the end, in most respects, the underlying goals are completely the same. And then it started to realize the structure is actually exactly the same. And then when you start to read some of and I don't usually make too much of this point because I think it loses something of what's going on. But you start to read people like Ibram Kendi saying that, that the racism and capitalism are tied together. And so there's still this element of, old school Marxism kind of like peeking through here and there. And I try not to make too much of those points, but then you can't avoid it's not just parallels, but it's literally the exact same. The whole theory is exactly the same at like every level of detail. And I think we should spend some time unpacking that, but I want to make sure that, we leave space for where we want to go with this, because I can start jumping into, Marxist theory of ideology. I can start talking about superstructure and base. I mean, all the stuff that Marx laid out has just kind of been retooled into this new, I call it actually neo-communism in the book instead of communism, because it's relying on neo-Marxist theory instead of Marxist theory. But otherwise, it's literally the same thing, and therefore it is the same.
I want to go into this with you. But first, a lot of people might question, well, why does that matter? So what if critical race theory is Marxist? Why would they care about this?
Yeah, I get hit with that actually kind of a lot from people on the left. They're like, oh, so you're just going to do kind of a genetic fallacy. You're going to say it comes out of Marxism or it is Marxism. And so you don't ever explain why that's bad. And it's as if like the history of the 20th century didn't happen. Everywhere Marxism has been tried, it fails. But if you read the book, you will, of course, discover that I go through why it fails, not just from kind of a, Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek analysis on the economics, that it explains why, a controlled economy or a planned economy doesn't have the sufficient level of information to be able to do the proper planning, so things fall apart. And then because of the kind of Sovietized structure that you end up with in the bureaucracy that runs this thing, that it's lies, cover up lies, and then what you're ending up with is kind of, a big giant civilizational Jenga tower that's going to tip over as the pieces fall out. It's not even just that. The whole thing is an inversion of reality. So it's always going to go there. So when you understand what Marxism is, almost at a faith-based level, what it proposes at its kind of core about the difference between, about the philosophical understanding, I should say, of how human beings exist and interact with the world, you can see why it's always going to fail. And that boils down, and I'm sure we'll unpack this again later, but just as a short summary, for Marxism, of all types, the world exists inside your subjective consciousness. You are first a subject, and you create the objective world according to your subjectivity. And then you come to know yourself as a subject that creates the objective world by doing this. And this is the fundamental inversion. It's living literally inside your own fantasy of how the world should be and believing that you can manifest it. But then it can only possibly work because if you're a subject and I'm a subject and we disagree, then something is going to go awry when we try to create two different objective realities. And the Marxist answer for what's happening is one of us, whoever's coming out on top, is dominating the other person. And so domination and oppression become intrinsic to the interrelations of people who disagree. And so the dominant person's obviously going to be framed as bad and is going to be characterized as an enemy or scapegoated. And the oppressed person is going to be given this idea that they have kind of double sight. They know more. They have to be taken as an authority. And so you're always going to have this kind of perpetual revolution that's rotting out from within of any power structure or hierarchy in society that's based off of this terrible theory, but not if you and I can both agree that we are actually social man. We are man meant to live in a society where everybody understands what the society is in the same way. So we're all creating the same society together in a communal form, which to, invoke just another great thinker who's recently died, E.O. Wilson, the great biologist, he talked about socialism and communism at one point, and he said, great idea, wrong species. It doesn't accord with human nature. It doesn't accord with how human beings interact with one another and in the world. And so it's going to collapse every single time because it misunderstands reality. It believes, in fact, that the limits we face in reality, and this is the key point, and Marx even says this in, I think this is in the the economic and philosophic manuscripts that he wrote in 1844, but I may have it mixed up with his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which was also 1844. He says in there that the problem is that the limits of subjectivity are just in your mind. And that, because it's a subjective-oriented belief system about how the world works, if there's a limitation, like you can't fly or something, just to be a little ridiculous, of course, he wouldn't necessarily have said that. If there's some limitation in the objective reality, it's because there's a limitation in our subjective understanding of the world, and that is caused by the social relations that condition our understanding. So if we can, as Michel Foucault, another famous kind of post-Marxist character of the late 20th century, said, if we can expand the potentialities of being, we can open up our subjectivity to the broadest possible thing that we can imagine, then we can actually recreate reality